Hello, welcome to Enlightning. I'm here this Friday with Mario Laureado. Hello, Mario.
Hello, Whitney.
Mario's going to teach us about Devfile, the Devfile today. Yes. Uh, Tell us about yourself, please, Mario.
Yes, so my name is Mario Laureado, and I'm a software engineer. I'm a senior principal software engineer for Red Hat, and I've been working on the Devfile for the last, 3, 4 years, probably, maybe more. But the thing I work on mainly is Eclipse Che and OpenShift dev spaces that are actually tools that use the dev file. So we needed the dev file for those projects. So we started the dev file project, I think around 3 or 4 years ago.
Amazing. I love a good specification that is widely adopted. It's just good all around. No matter which discipline, no matter which specification, it always seems like a good thing to me. We have hello from Lisa. She's here every show. Thank you so much, Lisa. Lisa said she is dancing in the intro. I'm always dancing through the intro too, but no one can see it, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Um, I forgot to warn you, Mario, that we'll be dancing at the very end, but just a little bit, just in the shoulders or whatever you're comfortable with. I'm sorry. I should have just left it alone. I'm sure you're nervous enough without me warning you that there's dancing. But one cool thing, Mario, I saw on your Twitter that you are now a CNCF ambassador. That's super cool.
Yes, I'm super excited about that. Yeah, that's my first experience as an ambassador for CNCF. Yeah, so looking forward to meet a lot of other ambassadors and people, especially with the KubeCon that is happening soon. So yeah, pretty
That's
excited.
cool. I got nominated to be, and I'm not nominated, chosen to be an ambassador also, which I'm thrilled about. But I don't think, when I applied for it, I don't think I understood what a big deal it is. So I'm excited about it for sure. And the thing, just like what you said, like there are a lot of cool perks for sure, but like I'm really excited to get to know the other ambassadors, and it's a great way for collaboration between people and countries and projects for us all to kind of get together and bring more cohesion to the group. I'm so excited. So we're like buddies by default.
Exactly.
I mean, Deshaun says he's dancing too. Excellent. Thank you, Deshaun. And congratulations to all the new CNCF ambassadors. There are about 150, 154, I believe, ambassadors, and that's global. And they're doing a great job, I think, of making sure lots of different countries are represented. Yeah, and I like that. So, speaking of, what country are you representing in the ambassador program?
Yeah, that's a tricky question actually. So I'm based in France, but actually I'm Italian. So I don't know. I actually when they ask the question, I answer France, but
Uh huh.
then at some point, uh, yeah, I think that at some point we had to put some flags in the internal Slack channels,
Uh
and I choose the Italian flag, so I could not. So.
It's an emoji, so you can do both, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Uh
exactly.
huh.
I can do both. Exactly.
That's fabulous. Well, I'm going to start moseying on behind the light board. Um, I want to ask the chat who's tuned in today to learn about Devfile. What tool are you currently using for developing on Kubernetes? Are you developing on Kubernetes? What are some challenges? What are some things you like about your current strategy? And then you are going to tell us during this time about your hobby. You're a marathon runner, which is so impressive. But I'm really curious. Marathon running to me seems like literal torture. I'm sure other people feel that way. Like, what inspired you to get started marathon running, and what was it like in the first stages of doing it when it must have been very difficult? That's yeah, and I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I
move on
mean,
back.
yeah, I haven't started so I started running those 5Ks or 10Ks like 20 years ago, probably. Uh,
Okay.
the thing that the reason why I run and I started running a lot is that I figure out that it's probably the only moment in the day where I actually can um, so avoid being distracted by anything. So I have the time
Ah.
to think about other stuff. I also listen a lot of podcasts or audiobooks when I run.
Uh-huh.
So, and usually what happens is that even if I don't want to run because I'm tired, etc., I may want to listen to the rest of the book
Uh-huh.
that I started listening, and I force myself to go out and run to
Nice.
just listen to the next chapter. So
You're
yeah,
only allowed to hear it if you're running. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Deshaun says
I mean,
running equals meditating.
yeah, that's so somebody does meditation and others are doing running.
Hmm. What are some of your favorite podcasts or books or
So
some?
the from podcast point of view, so there is the Kubernetes podcast that is the one that as soon as it uh, goes live, I usually listen to it. There are other technical podcasts. There is one about security that I listen now that I don't remember exactly the name of that podcast. But then there is a French podcast on software development that is called the so there is another one that is the software
What
defined.
did you what did Oh, sorry to interrupt you. What did you say the first one was about Kubernetes?
Yeah, the Kubernetes podcast.
Okay. Oh, that's very simple. I don't know
From
how I missed
yeah
it.
the Kubernetes podcast from Google. Uh,
Okay, nice. And
it's
then you were saying software defined talk was one of the ones you like?
yes, I think it's software defined talk. Yeah,
Yeah, that's put on by my coworker Kote makes that podcast.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've and there is the uh, some also other podcasts on running as well. So I like the
Ah.
meta of like the you're running and you're listening to somebody that is talking about running. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I very much like plant-based nutrition, and I would play plant-based nutrition podcasts while I was cooking my meals for the week, back when I was getting started, especially.
exactly. So it's
It's
and there is the Cascoders. It's a French podcast from my colleague Manuel Bernard. So he's working for Red
cool.
Hat as well, and he's really well known in France. He's a French podcast. He's a tech. He's a Java podcast. Uh,
Cool.
so it's really well known in France.
Nice. And I want to say hi to Koromaju, who's here almost every time too. Hi, Koromaju. Thank you so much for being here 2 days in a row. All right. So here we are. We made it behind the light board. So what I want to talk about to kick off this conversation is what was the world like before the dev file that caused this specification to need to get made? So give me some context, please.
Yes. So we were building a platform to provision development environment, and
Mm-hmm.
we had a JSON definition of those development environment that was hard to understand for humans. So I
Ah.
yeah, it was I think like the factory JSON we call it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it was something that defined all the features. So it was something that was supposed to encode all the feature that you will include in your development environment, but it was not easily understandable. It was JSON first of all, so it's not easy
Mm-hmm.
to edit manually, and the JSON format didn't help, but also there were some duplication, so redundancy of things that are okay if you're actually if it's a machine that is creating that file and updating it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want, so at some point we say, okay, but we want to make it easy for developers to customize their development environment. We want to allow them to update the different features in their development environment. So we need to come up with a format that makes it easy to define and to update a development environment, right?
Yes. So the development environments were defined, but not human friendly. I imagine, I'm guessing here, that probably they were defined in different ways depending on which tools you were using to implement the definition, and that's part of
Yeah.
the reason that.
Yeah. Let's say no. At the beginning, we were not considering to build a specification that would be used by other tools. So we were building an IDE, right? So an IDE that
Okay.
was running remotely, and we wanted
Okay.
to have a file specification that worked for our platform.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, it was I think 3 years ago, we 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 decided that we needed to make it something that was usable for other tools as well. So not only
Okay.
for the tool. And at the time, so the when we created the Devfile, it was for Eclipse Che. So Eclipse Che is a platform that allows you to start a development environment that will run in Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Okay.
if you need to start a development environment in Kubernetes, as a developer, what are you looking for? What do you want to be able to choose as a developer? So you probably want to define a repository, so the source code, the repository that you want to clone so that you have the source code in your development environment. This is something. And there are other features like that. So we try to identify the important things, and we started building this file where we wanted to have in a concise way, in a format that one was concise and easy to read. All the characteristics or the features of the development environment.
So I think this is you kind of touched on something that I definitely want to dig into a little bit. I don't know if we've talked about my story, but I'm pretty new to tech overall. And so I'm hungry for a lot of context before we really even dig into what's good about your tool. And one thing I'd really like to talk about is like, what kinds of things do you need to define in a development environment?
Yeah,
And
that's a really good question. I mean, also for a developer, this is something that usually when you start developing on your laptop. So I'm thinking of like the classical development environment. You probably the first thing that you need is an IDE, right? You need to decide which IDE you're gonna use.
and that's something you're defining as part of your environment?
We used to, but then I can talk you why we actually decided not to make it part of it. So today is not part of it anymore. But the very beginning, it was part of it. Like in the YAML in the specification, we were saying, okay, I want to use this version of the IDE. Okay.
Interesting.
We decided to remove it because at some point we figured out that first of all, you can set up a development environment without an IDE.
Yeah.
So I mean, the first thing that you need is you want to be able to compile your source code. So this is what you need. So the core of it. So the very core is today it's the part of the Devfile that is called the components. So you define some components that are usually containers. So you can specify a component as a container that will have the tools that allows you to build your application.
Okay. I think I love this and I definitely want to capture it, but I think you're getting ahead of me a little bit in terms of how it works. And I just want to talk like from a very general perspective, not even Devfile specific. Like what kinds of things am I thinking of when I'm thinking of what I need to define in a development environment? So I think you said your container image that like what container image? Like the application you're working on, your supporting applications, your third party stuff, probably maybe all of the above.
Yeah, I think all of the above.
Okay.
But the before even the application. So the thing that you haven't mentioned, the container that you haven't mentioned is the development tools. Like
Okay.
if you're building a Java application,
Uh-huh.
you need first probably a container that is not the container of your application where you actually will run your application. You need the container that has Maven or Gradle, so and as the JDK. So you need a container that has development tools so that you can use that container for building your application.
And
Okay,
then, yeah. And
if
then where, yeah,
if
sorry.
you want to go even so, maybe we can. So I think that it's important to mention that um, all of this interest in having a specification is because we want to solve a big problem that is about making development environment repeatable, so that if you have a new developer in your team, you can say, hey, this is the specification. You just need to use that file that defines your application, and you use a
Uh-huh.
tool that understand that specification, and you will be ready to code and to develop and to contribute to the application in a few seconds. Just the time that the tool is that is able to read the dev file will set up the environment for you in a few seconds, and you will be able to code. So the idea is really that we wanted to have some immutable, repeatable development environment, because the problem as a developer, the thing that is painful is always you need to follow some guides where they tell you what prerequisites you need to have in your machine to be able to compile the code, to debug the code. So these are things that need to be, those guides need to be manually updated by somebody, and often you forget to something, and then the tests are not working, or and I remember that it's probably that was 15 years ago or so. So I was a consultant, and we often went to work for large companies like banks or insurance companies. And the first week, we usually spent the first week setting up our development environment. So you had to install all the tools in your machine, and then you had to um, configure them. You had to get the source code, then you had to get the connection and the accounts to connect to third-party services where needed to test the application. So at that point, we really, so I remember with my colleague, we were looking for something that would help us automate that setting up of an environment. That is the need that then brought me to work on a container-based development environment. So you can define your development environment with containers, and then the need to actually specify that container-based development environment through a file that is, so it's software-defined development environment, and this is where we are today.
Great. So we need a dev specification. It makes it repeatable. We talked about an onboarding situation, but I also am hearing about ephemeral development environments where on Kubernetes you create the environment, you develop for the day, then you destroy the environment. So the environment is not always running.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I wrote that up here, but you didn't say it. So I want to verify that's correct.
Yeah,
And
no,
then,
that's correct. Yeah.
And then it sounds like there are a lot of tools out there for one to be able to develop on Kubernetes. And if we're using this Devfile specification, it seems like then you're tool agnostic. If they're all using the same spec, you could switch your tool more easily instead of getting locked into a certain situation.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the goal. So we make it a specification, and we actually make it a CNCF project because we wanted that to be in company neutral from a vendor neutral organization that would guarantee that other companies would actually be able to contribute to that project. So that allows us. So first of all, it was just a project within Red Hat. So first of all, it was a project just for Eclipse Che. Then it a project that was the Devfile was started to be used by a couple of other projects internally in Red Hat, and at that point, then we started talking with AWS, and with AWS, we decided that we wanted to make it a CNCF project because otherwise AWS was not able to participate, to contribute to that, and so last year it became a CNCF project, and now there are other companies contributing to participating and using the Devfile as well.
Cool. So do you feel like we captured it? Why do we need a development environment specification, making it repeatable for onboarding, ephemeral environments, tool agnostic? Is there anything else you'd like to get to put here?
No, I think we can go more in deep on those points, but yeah, I think that those are like the main reason why you need a specification.
Okay. And then I just for my own personal learning, I would like to get in a little more on what needs to be defined in a development environment, because I have a feeling it can get pretty complex. Like, do you need to define the infrastructure that it should be deployed onto? Would that be a thing? Do you need to define what your Kubernetes services and deployments look like, your Kubernetes objects? What kinds of things do you need to define in this dev file?
Yeah, in that side, mainly you have the container where you want to build, because you need to build your application. Then you need to test the application. So you need also, as you mentioned here, the backing services that are required as well. But those are like the components; those are containers. But you don't need you need something more. Development environment is also. So because if I give you those containers and the source code, how are you going to build? So you probably need the definition of the commands that needs to be executed to build the application. So the other important section are commands. Commands in the sense of a command that you will need to execute for building or for running or for debugging your application. So there is a list of commands that you can specify in your dev file that will allow you to build or test your application.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are like commands for and usually commands are also something that you can execute from the GUI of your IDE. So the important thing here is that we are when you specify a command in your dev file, you may want in VS Code, for example, to find it as a task, so that the user doesn't need to know anything about the application. It just say, okay, what is the default build task of this project? And we define it in the dev file, and then the user just say, okay, I just select the default build command, and boom, I build the application. The default command to test the application, boom, and I'm testing the application. I don't need to know anything except the fact that I need to know when I'm in my IDE, how do I run predefined commands.
So is this task one of the dev file components that we're going to talk about here shortly?
No, the commands are and the tasks are a separate one. So
Okay.
So the dev file, it's a YAML where you have when you have some root fields, so at the very top of the dev file, so you can define commands that are, it's a list of command, and then at the same level you define components. And usually, but you're right, the two things are related, because when you are executing a command, you want to execute it in one component. So let's say, for example, you want to compile your Java application. So you want to build it. So you do a Maven install. So the command is Maven install, but then you need to specify, okay, I'm gonna execute Maven install in that component, in the development tooling component, not in the Redis component. Redis component is that you will use for when you're testing, then it will be used by your application. But yeah, does that make sense?
Cool. Yes, it absolutely does. And I think maybe as we get into more Devfile specific things, I might want to add things to this general development environment list. But meanwhile, we have a couple questions from chat that I want to get to. Deshaun asked, and related to what needs to be defined in a development environment, what about the operating system? Yes, that would be a good one. Okay, we'll add it to the list. And then Deshaun also asks, are we able to provide definitions for different architectures? So half of the team runs M1 ARM64 and the other half runs AMD 64.
Okay, yeah. So I think that the important thing here is that is something that we haven't. I didn't say that explicitly, but we're talking about cloud development environment. So those development environment will be executed, will run in Kubernetes. Okay, so when we talk about our operating system, this is usually Linux. So I mean, it's a container that is running in Kubernetes on a Linux operating system. We also have Windows containers, but I mean, it's something that we haven't seen yet, but it's really not something that you specify in the dev file.
So the operating system is part of building the container that's going to run. It's not something that you specify in the dev file for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not saying what is like you specify a container, and then the container architecture and the container operating system is something that is not defined in the. It depends on where Kubernetes is running mainly. So yeah. So if it's running, Kubernetes is running on a Raspberry Pi, then you need to make sure that container, that architecture is supported by the container that you want to run. But yeah, the idea here is we want all the team. If you have your team is using different operating systems on their laptop, the development environment won't be in the laptop. It will be in the Kubernetes cluster. So they will share, all of the team will share the same operating system, the same containers, yeah, and the same also resources in terms of memory, CPU, disk, network.
Cool. So we have another question from Komaraju. What is the difference between Visual Studio Lens and Devfile? Or maybe those are three things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Lens, if I'm correct, is kind of a dashboard for developers for Kubernetes. So it's the only thing that I'm not super sure. But anyway, the Devfile is a specification of a file format, so it's not an application. Visual Studio Code is so Visual Studio in general is an IDE, and Visual Studio Code is the IDE is an IDE that is able to run in your browser. So there is the Electron based, so you can install Visual Studio Code on your laptop, or you can run Visual Studio Code in your browser with the client part running in your browser and the server part running in a container. And this is what today we've been working a lot with for those software-defined development environment. So Visual Studio Code is probably the most popular IDE today, together with the JetBrains IDE. Those are the ones that we are trying to run on those Devfile-based development environment.
That makes sense. Great. So what would you like to talk about next? The component aspects of Devfile or something else completely?
I think that components make sense. We have talked about components that are where you can define your development tools. We have mentioned also that is like your backing services, as you mentioned. So like the third-party services, like if you need a database when you're developing for testing your application, you will define it there. Now, another thing is that, yeah, you can use also component to define the image, the container that will run your application. So
okay, do these components have names?
No, they have types.
Types. Okay.
There are different types of components. So you have you can have a container. So the one type. So the main type is container. So you are defining one of the component of your development environment. You can define it as a container, or the second most popular one, so the most useful one, is a Kubernetes. So Kubernetes component. That means that instead of defining your component as a container, just a container, you can define it as a Kubernetes YAML. So yeah, YAML resource, but define it as a
resource.
Yes, as a manifest, a Kubernetes manifest. I would say manifest rather than because
I was going to say resource.
Or resource, yeah, resources plural, because you can actually have a manifest where you can you're defining your pod, your services, your volumes,
right
on so that you can use actually your production manifest. The things that you use to deploy your application in production, you're actually including them in your development environment, so that the parity between your development environment and the production is we are trying to reduce it to zero, so that that when you this is the thing that is really powerful with cloud-based development environment, because you are developing on the platform where usually you want to run your application. So you don't need to do anything special to test your application on Kubernetes. You're already developing on Kubernetes. So if you need to deploy and test your application on Kubernetes, it's really straightforward because you're already on Kubernetes. And with the Kubernetes resource, so the Kubernetes component allows you to include manifest that you use for production in your Devfile.
Cool. So these are types of components.
Yeah.
And then you had said some examples of components that I missed because I was writing production.
So I think that for like the example, for example, for the container component, it's like a default. You have the official Go or the OpenJDK or OpenJDK images that can be used as container components for development, or you can use the Redis official image to include as a container. Those are like examples of or the Python official container. Or what we usually do is the thing that we're currently trying to do is that instead of having one different container for every tool or language, we're building something that is called the universal developer image, so that it's an image that includes all the tools to do development in Java, in .NET, in Python, in Go, in Rust, so that developers at the very beginning, the first time that they start their development environment, that they don't need to choose the image at all. They just get the default one that is the universal developer image.
Okay. But that's building, coming
Yeah,
up.
That's building. Of course, for all of those languages, so you may want to use the same image also for running. For example, for Python, you don't need it's just one image for running or for executing. But then for the execution, even if you may want to use the same image, if you want to use your production image will be probably a lighter one, so one without many tools. So you won't have tools that you want to have in a development environment. Like for example, if you're developing, you probably want Git in your container. So you want to have Git as a tool in your container as a developer. But
okay.
If you want to run your application in your production container, you don't want Git, you don't want any development tool there, because you want that the surface for security reasons. So you don't want to expose too much of tools that can have security vulnerabilities. So that's the main reason why you usually want a small image with just your application when you are actually running production. So that's where the Kubernetes resource component can be helpful. So there are also other components. We just mentioned a couple of them. I don't know if that gets we're going too in deep in that, but.
So I have to rely on you for that since I don't see the big picture like you do. But so the Python container component wouldn't have Git. At that point, it's a Kubernetes resource component, is what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that your development component, so your development container, it can be the Python official container is usually your development tool.
Okay.
But when you run it in production, you usually want to package with another container, and you want also to define some feature of the workload that you will provision on Kubernetes that are defined in the manifest of your deployment. With like the readiness probe, or the memory that will the memory resources limits, CPU limits, etc. So when you test your application, you probably want to use that for running the application. You want to use that manifest to make sure that that you won't have surprises when you're actually deploying your application in production. So when you're ready, when you finish developing and you finish your changes to the Git repository, you may want to have tested your application with in environment that is really close to production. And that's what Kubernetes resources help you with.
Cool. I want to say hi to Walid. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. So glad to have you. So some examples, if you're just concerned about developing, you might use OpenJDK official container or a Python official container, and you'd use that to develop. If you're trying to really approximate or get as close as you can to your production environment, you might use more Kubernetes components to really replicate what's happening in your development situation with what's going to happen as soon as it's deployed to production. So an example you gave is a readiness probe for that.
Yes, readiness probe, or so I was talking about memory limits, so CPU limits. Those are like definition of feature of your of the workload that you will run on Kubernetes that you would probably want to test before you push your changes in your Git repository.
Gotcha. Oops.
Okay, so but yeah, the first container is useful when for building your application. The second component, so the Kubernetes component, is more useful for testing your application.
For instead of saying building, I want to say developing. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Yeah, or okay. For maybe coding or whatever. But yeah.
Useful for testing. Makes a lot of sense. Great. Do you know something we haven't done yet that I would love to do is define what is a dev file and have a solid definition up there so that people who join in later, like our friend Walid, can have more context that it's a specification. I don't think we've written that on the board yet.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you want to have a simple example of that file written there. So I don't.
What do you mean?
Like that file is just are like 5 lines of so written in a YAML file.
Oh, I've never written. I've managed all this time without actually trying to write a YAML file on the board. But before that, I want a sentence or so that says a dev file is and states a definition of what the dev file is.
Yeah, so the file is a file format for defining.
Would you prefer file format or specification?
It's a specification. You can say specification.
For defining
cloud development environment.
Cool.
Using maybe a YAML format so that we include the format. YAML, yeah, format.
Excellent. All right. This is what a dev file is. And so far we've talked about what generally speaking you might need to define in a development environment, and then specifically what components you can create when you're making a dev file. So you distinguish between a container component versus a Kubernetes resources components.
Yeah.
Great. Cool.
Yeah, and so these are like components. There are other components as well. I don't think we need to go in that deep. But
okay,
the other part of the dev file that is important are the commands. So that allows you to execute some task in those components that you have defined before, so that you can prepare for the developer that is going to come and want to debug the application. You can provide him, guide him with some predefined commands.
So we have Devfile commands, and they're paired with components.
Yes.
So the component can be created and then commands can be run immediately upon creation.
Yes, either they can be run automatically, or they are just available for the developer. When the developer wants to test the application, it just... Okay, so those are like predefined commands that can be available on your UI, so that you can select it, and as soon as you select it, it will be executed, so that you will be able to test your application without actually having to read anything. As you can start and develop in a few seconds.
So you just mentioned a UI. So the UI would come into play. So with whatever tool is actually implementing the dev file is going to have some way to deal with these commands for the developer to interface with them. And that might be different depending on the tool.
Exactly.
So predefined commands that are available in the UI, and then paired with a component, right?
Exactly.
And then let's give an example, please.
It's like Maven install is one example for
Okay.
For compiling the application.
Okay.
So it's MVN. It's because the command line of Maven is MVN. And this is the typical example for like a Java developer. But you can have the same thing with like Python, and then the name of the application that you want to execute, or for Node.js, the same thing. You have like yarn install is another example of commands that you want to execute.
Py install, did you say?
Yeah, no, like yarn.
Okay.
Yeah. It's yarn is the tool. Yarn.
It's a package manager, right?
Yeah, it's a tool for building, for compiling and running, executing, and getting the dependencies of Node.js application.
Cool. And then also, like, testing would be good for this, you said? Testing commands?
Yeah, exactly. So
then,
well, the next command, it depends on your application. Usually you have you can execute. So for example, if you have your Hello World application, you may able to just run hello. It depends if you have compiled it with Maven. You may probably have a Hello World jar. So it's about running the Java jar hello.jar, for example.
Okay.
Or if you have compiled it to an executable, it's just running the dot hello world, right?
Yeah. So instead of saying specific commands, I want to say like install commands. So dependency install commands, compiling commands.
Exactly.
Testing commands, start commands.
Yeah.
Just as
debugging commands.
Cool. And we have a question for you too in chat. I'm going to grab that. Walid has a question. I attended your Rejects talk, EU 2022. I was wondering if you could recommend interesting ones that surprised you or a good use case of custom development files. So first question is, what was your talk at Rejects in 2022 EU?
Yeah, I did a talk about the Devfile last year in Valencia. So I was with Ida. So that is was a PM for AWS. So we did a talk presenting the Devfile together. So I think it was the first time that we were presenting the Devfile at a conference. In January, it became a CNCF project, and then in April, I think it was, we presented that to Cloud Native Rejects. Yeah, and we were, so the important thing is that it's hard to present the Devfile without actually talking about the application of the Devfile. So the tools, the client that implement that, and the first part of the talk is, okay, we introduce the problem. So we want a repeatable development environment. We want something that works with different IDEs, with different tools. So we want a specification that is so that can multiple companies can contribute to. And then we, after introducing that, after showing one small example, the simplest example of Devfile, then we showed our tools, how actually we could use, how the Devfile is usable when you have a tool that implements that. And yeah, that's what we show during that talk.
And then the second part of Willie's question is, what is a good use case for a custom Devfile?
Well, as soon as you need a specific version of a development tool, you want to specify somewhere, like you want version, version 3.2 of Maven. So you may want to have somewhere, you want to encode that somewhere in your source code, that you need that version of Maven, or you need a specific version of Go for running your application. Because the problem is that the first person that will try your application, that will try to compile and run your application, if it doesn't have exactly that version of that dependency, it will fail. So if you include that file, as soon as the Devfile is there, the developer doesn't need to think about where can I get version 3.2 of Maven, because maybe it's like a 1-year-old version of Maven, and I have updated that with the newest one. I don't want to go back and use an old one. So usually with the Devfile, you are able to start in Kubernetes development environment with exactly the version, the environment variable, so with all the tools that you need for starting coding and testing your application.
Great, thank you. I had this idea that I was going to write the last thing as I let you answer that question, and then because the question was so interesting, I forgot the commands we were going to write. So if you do remember what the last command, probably not. Installing commands, compiling commands, testing commands, start commands, kubectl commands.
No, I was mentioning debugging commands.
Debugging, that's what it was. Great. Awesome. So cool. So the Devfile commands are predefined commands that become available in the UI of the implementing technology, and then it's compared with a certain component that you've made, and then all these different ideas of what kinds of commands, Tecton commands, will lead says too. Cool. So I guess I'd be like more like CI/CD commands. I'll put it in there.
Yes. We are talking here about the Devfile is about everything that happens during the what we call the inner loop. So it's just before CI/CD, right?
Oh, okay.
So, but this is not wrong, because this is as for the Kubernetes manifest, that you want them to be as close to as close as possible to the one that you will use in production. Also, when you're building your application, when you're developing your application and you're testing your application, you want the tools that you use in your development environment to be as close as possible to the one that are used in CI/CD. Does that make sense? So I mean, if you're if your CI/CD use one version of Ruby to execute your application, you probably, so to test your application, you probably want to have exactly that same version in your development environment, because otherwise it will happen that everything works on your development environment because you're using the latest version of Ruby. But you commit your changes and your CI/CD get broken. So the CI got broken because the CI is using a different version of Ruby. Okay. So you want them to be close, and that's why again you can use some CI/CD definition tools. So we want tools also for CI/CD to be able to reuse I don't know, like a compose file or a Docker file, so to be reusable in your development environment, so that you will reuse exactly the same artifacts that are used in the CI/CD. You will use it in your development environment.
Waleed has another comment too. Good point about the internal loop, but I could also use it as a terminal to deploy for testing.
Yeah, but that's what I mean with the inner loop, is that it's everything that happens before
CI/CD.
Before CI/CD, but before the moment when CI/CD starts, when you push your code in the Git repository. So you can test, you can use the same tools. You can even say, oh, I want to use Jenkins in my development environment. I want to make sure that Jenkins work, and I want to. Yeah, you can do that. But you're doing that from the inner loop, because you're not pushing to the Git repository. And when you push the repository, the source code that you have developed get integrated with the source code of your team. And that's where the integration happens, and the outer loop starts, and the CI/CD starts. So you can test things from you can test everything from. So I don't know if the question was exactly about that or about something else, but definitely it's like the thing that defines where the CI/CD starts and the development ends is when you push the code in your Git repository, and you want everything. You want to test everything before pushing to the Git repository, so that you do not introduce in the Git repository something that won't work for your colleague or will break the CI/CD.
Great. So we have two different types of Devfile components, and then either of those types can have commands associated with them. And so that's how the Devfile is set up.
But the other thing interesting about commands is that they can be combined together.
So basically, they're paired with a component, but it's not a one-to-one. It could be one-to-many.
No, one command is associated to exactly one component.
Okay.
But there is a special component, a special command that allow you to execute multiple commands one after the other. So that imagine that you want to set up your database, then compile your application, and then execute your application. Instead of having, and those commands like set up your database will target one different component. It will target your component where your database is. So you cannot do everything. It's like preparing the database, compiling the code, and running the code. You cannot do that on one command. So you need 3 commands for those things. So what you can do is that there is a special type of command that is the composite. And in a composite command, you can specify, you can reference other commands that will be executed sequentially.
Okay. References commands that will be executed sequentially.
Exactly.
And he said, for example, setting up a database.
Exactly.
Cool. Excellent. Do you think we captured the Devfile commands well?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Great. What else do you want to tell us about Devfile? I'm going to do.
Probably the thing that it can be interesting is the different application that implements that.
And that one thing I'm interested in, which seems related, is I understand that there's like a Devfile repository, so you can pull someone else's Devfile and use it for yourself. I want to know more about that too, which seems related to the different applications.
Yes, definitely. Yes, there is it's a service that there is an online service that is called the Devfile registry. So on registry.devfile.io, it's like the online Devfile registry where we have so a catalog of different Devfiles that could be used as examples for starting Java development environment or Maven development, or Node.js development environment. So you have different Devfiles. It's a catalog of Devfiles. It's called Devfile registry. Yeah.
So the Devfile registry is a catalog of Devfiles, and they're not, so it sounds like they're not meant to be used outright for your environment. They're used to be used as like a boilerplate to get started, or maybe examples, right?
Yeah, they're usually associated with examples. So you have a Java, the Java Devfile, that is, then you have 2 or 3 examples of Java applications, so that your application can use that Devfile with that Git repository, and this is kind of a starter for your application. You can use that for start your application. Then you can change the source code, and then you can push that to your Git repository, and then you can share that with your team.
Cool. Excellent.
Yeah, this is the and the Devfile is something so that it's something that you can also deploy in your Kubernetes cluster, let's imagine that you have that you want to provide in your enterprise network, you want to provide a catalog of example application, because you know that your developers are usually, so you want some standard tooling, some standard framework that need to be used in your enterprise. So you can use the Devfile registry for providing those starter projects for starting new applications for your developers.
So there is an online publicly accessible catalog, but you can also create a private internal catalog.
Exactly. So the same catalog that we are running as a service can be also deployed on-prem by somebody else.
Cool. So in that way, it's defining a company's best practice, which I like.
Exactly. And this is something. So another interesting project that is still part of the Devfile is it's there are a few other projects. Let me make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. I think that probably. So the library is the other important part. So we have it's a Go library that allows you to actually implement the Devfile. So it's a library that it's able to parse the Devfile and to generate the correspondent Kubernetes objects to create your development environment on Kubernetes.
So with this library, you wouldn't technically need one of the implementation tools, or maybe it's like a shared toolkit that all the implementation
Exactly.
tools can use.
It's a kind of an SDK or a toolkit that you can use to implement the Devfile with your tool.
And it's called the Devfile library?
Exactly, yeah.
We have nice comments from Waleed. Waleed says, great call. Oops. Great call, and thank you. Good vibes. Thank you. Thank you for your good vibes. So I'm going to write about the library, and then what we started to talk about but then didn't get into is possible applications of the Devfile library. SDK to implement Devfiles, yes?
Yes.
And that's also probably worth writing down is a Devfile must be implemented by a tool. And maybe we can list some of the tools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Red Hat tools that so there are three products in Red Hat that implements that. So these are like the things that are better. And so the first one is the one I work for. It is called OpenShift Codespaces.
OpenShift Devspaces, got it.
And
Eclipse Che?
Yes, Eclipse Che is actually the upstream of OpenShift Codespaces. So
okay,
it's the same thing. OpenShift Codespaces or Eclipse Che are exactly the same thing. And the other tool is a command line tool that is called Odo, ODO.
Okay. All right.
That uses the Devfile, but you see that in that case there is no IDE involved. So although it's a command line tool, so it needs only the specification to be able to build and run your application. So use the Devfile for that format. Then so AWS is using that in their development environment. I think it's called Code Catalyst today. the service that
Is
they
that one word or two? Code Catalyst.
Code Catalyst is one word.
Okay. Excellent.
And JetBrains, it's using it in its service that is called JetBrains Space.
Cool. JetBrains Space.
Yeah.
That's a cool name. Okay. That's probably enough. There's more available on the documentation. Oh,
Yeah.
here we have a question from Walid. Is GitHub Codespaces based on the Devfile?
No, it's not. And so GitHub Codespaces is basically running using another format, another specification that is the dev container, JSON. That is not a CNCF. Is as far as I know. So until today, it hasn't been part of any. It's not vendor neutral. It has been. It's controlled by Microsoft today. So this is what is used on for Codespaces.
And then I also talked, I did an episode about DevSpace, as I've been doing a lot about tools for developing on Kubernetes. And so they have a DevSpace YAML. And I guess the question more is, what does it take? Like, you've created a specification, and Red Hat and AWS have both adopted it, and JetBrains. So it's you're doing well. But like, what does it take really to get everybody on board? Like, what are the challenges in because it's one thing to make a specification, it's another thing to actually get people to use the specification.
Yeah, I think that the challenge that we had since the beginning is, first of all, it needs to be something as generic as possible, so that all the companies are happy with it. So if you make it so, and this means saying no a lot of time. So because you have like a customer that is a Red Hat customer that tells you, hey, I would like to have like the IDE in the specification of the IDE in the Devfile. But if I put the IDE, then maybe there will be another company will say it's not for us. It's not the thing that our customer are asking. So we need to. It should be as descriptive as possible, so that enables developer to write and to encode their development environment. But at the same time, we should be really careful on what we add in the API. That's the tough part, and we made a few mistakes. We're still fighting for them, and we're trying now to deprecate some parts of the Devfile that are actually, so that we introduced too rapidly at the very beginning.
Okay. Interesting. That's so fascinating. Well, Lee says Loft has a product called DevSpace. That's exactly what I was just talking about. I've done an Enlightning on DevSpace. There's also, I did one on telepresence, but I don't think telepresence has a declarative aspect to it. And we also talked about localhost, and I'm also unclear about whether that one has, but those are the CNCF, Walid, the CNCF related developments on Kubernetes projects are localhost, telepresence, DevSpace, and Devfile. So
yeah, but I think those are really different projects.
Yeah.
Although, like, unfortunately, the name of OpenShift DevSpaces is really close to the Loft spaces. But those are really not the same kind of project. So we're not competing at all for that. So they are tools for developers, but I think that they can be used together because they're not doing the same thing. They're not answering problems. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm trying to leave enough room on the board to talk about applications. So are you ready to move on to that part?
Yes. What do you want to talk about for application? What?
Oh,
Like,
when I say, you started to say a thing and then I just remembered. So I actually am, so when we say application, it's kind of a word that can mean a literal application, but I think what you meant when you said the word application was different ways that dev files can be used.
mhm.
Yeah. And so I'm gonna, do you want to move on to that?
I think I was actually when I said application, it was more like the tools that have implemented the dev file rather than the
Oh,
way
okay.
it gets used.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have been talking about
Yeah,
application.
we talk about that. So I
Got
think
it.
the way I think that the way it's used is really to have repeatable development environments.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that we can talk about is another tool that is implementing the dev file that I've not talked about. That is, but is like it has influenced a lot how we have specified the dev file today.
Mm-hmm.
So what we wanted um, uh, beyond, so at some point, okay, we got the dev file specification. It's just one file where you can specify things. At some point, we say, but what if we wanted to make a development environment as a resource, a Kubernetes resource? So like um, you could say, okay, at Kubernetes, you extend
Mm.
Kubernetes with a new custom resource.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that, and we did that. So what we did is that the dev file is defined in Go code, and then it generates the open API, so the model of the specification of the
Uh-huh.
file. But at the same time, we also use it. We use the same Go code to generate the customer source definition of a
Mm-hmm.
Kubernetes resource that is called the dev workspace. So when you can apply that to Kubernetes cluster, and you will be able to start a development environment using kubectl.
Dev workspace.
Yeah,
So this is a Kubernetes custom resource.
exactly. And a Kubernetes controller.
I love the controller, so important. So you can make a custom Kubernetes object and watch that object to make sure your development environment stays in the states that you've defined.
Yeah, and you can edit that so that you can change something on the fly. So, for example, you want to get more memory, you just change
Mm-hmm.
the definition of that customer source and you get more memory. You want more CPU, you change the definition, you get more CPU. You want to use another content, so you want to add a database to your development
Mm-hmm.
environment. You just patch your dev workspace object and you add a new component that is Postgres. And then in 5 seconds, you have a database in your development environment. So we thought that yeah, Kubernetes is able to so it's what we call the is one of those orchestrators that were orchestrating, so that we're um,
Mm-hmm.
scheduling jobs, scheduling workloads on a cluster of nodes. And we say, okay, but why? What if instead of just plain workloads defined with pods or deployment, we would let developers define development environment and then let Kubernetes schedule those development environment in the cluster. So that makes Kubernetes as a development platform actually. So this is something that has a lot of challenges because Kubernetes has not been designed as a development platform.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are hard to make it work as they work on your laptop. But yeah, the definition of the introduction of the controller and the CRD are exactly for making development environment in Kubernetes cluster native. And when something is native in your cluster, you are able to control it closely. You're able to find out if you're not able to mount a volume or there are problems with the different the resources that you want to attach to your development environment. So that is super powerful. So for example, we have customers that say, okay, we have a Kubernetes cluster that is attached to some nodes that are using GPUs, so like NVIDIA cards on the nodes, and we want to use those GPU cards in our development environment so that developers will be able to use those GPUs. They don't need to have them in their laptop. They will be able to use them from their development environment running on Kubernetes. And this is super straightforward now that we are able to, the development environment is a native object in Kubernetes. We're just saying, hey, you just need to add an annotation and they will be scheduled on the node where the GPU is, and the developer will be able to use that.
So modifications to the development environment are handled by Kubernetes instead of being handled manually.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I mean, the controller does the reconciliation. You say, okay, add Postgres. You define it in that YAML. The dev workspace object is basically a Devfile plus some metadata that are needed for a Kubernetes resource. So it's really the core of a dev workspace is the Devfile.
Cool. I guess it'd be so the Devfile is at the core of this definition.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to write CRD. All right, cool.
Yeah, and that has influenced us a lot in the specification of the Devfile because we had to, the specification had to be consistent with Kubernetes CRD. So we could not,
we have a great, sorry to interrupt. Do you want to, I'm sorry, did you get, we have a great question. So with this dev workspace custom resource, do developers need to understand the Kubernetes annotations? Because that seems like more than what developers want to deal with. That's a great segue just to an overall question about like what is the developer experience here in dealing with the Devfile?
Yes. So no, that's a great question. If you want to use some advanced feature of your underlying Kubernetes cluster, you probably need to know what. So you want to use GPUs. Well, you need to know that, and you need to know how to specify that in your Devfile. But beyond that, Devfile is really you need to know what a container is. You need to know that how to build a container, how to write a Docker file where you can run where you can define your tools that you will need for development. That is what you need, but you don't need to know anything about Kubernetes, because the Devfile is really we want to hide the Kubernetes complexity. Is just mainly the most important thing is just the container. You need to say, hey, I want to use this Java container for doing Java development. That's it, and that's what you don't need to specify more than that.
So it sounds like if, as a developer, you're probably going to take advantage of the registry feature and either get publicly available Devfile or your company Devfile, what they're telling you to use, and then take that Devfile into your whatever tool is implementing it. So that experience is going to be different depending on which tool you're using. But ideally, the tools are minimizing what you need to know as a developer, what you need to know about Kubernetes. Hopefully, you're taking a pre-existing dev file, you're pairing it with your implementation choice, and then you're good to go and develop and not really think about Kubernetes at all.
Yeah, you at the end, the developer that will use the dev file, it doesn't need to know anything about Kubernetes. So what he will see is just an ID, the ID that he used. So like or she, yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
That's the only thing that the developer is going to see. It's the IDE.
So to be clear, a developer is not expected to write a dev file from scratch. That's probably the dev file is probably going to be handled by maybe like the Kubernetes expert on the application team, or maybe even at an operations level that's being distributed as part of the registry, right?
Yes, we're also, to even make it even simpler, we want to hide the dev files spec for somebody that is not interested to that. So we have a VS Code walkthrough that we're building. So that is asking you a question like, what container do you want for developing? You say, okay, I want that container. Okay, we write the dev file for you, and that's it. So you're not exposed to the dev file at all. You just can start coding. You see the IDE, and then it's like if you're coding locally. You don't know that you're on Kubernetes.
I'm going to capture that. The file is meant to be hidden from the developer. Is that accurate?
Cool. So until they don't need it, we want to hide it as much as possible. So so that means having like this walkthrough that guides you in the creation of the dev file, or the dev file registry examples that are already there, so that you don't need to edit it.
Is the walkthrough specific to the OpenShift dev spaces that you work on, or is that like a dev file level project?
It's a dev file level project.
Cool. Do you have something else you want to tell me to put in the space, or shall I put about the walkthrough in there?
Or you can put the walkthrough. I don't think.
Okay, I'm running low on real estate, so cool. Dev file walkthrough, and it's a UI.
Yes, it's a VS Code extension. Okay, so that we're working on. So today is not published on the marketplace yet, but so I wanted to mention that just for to make to explain what's the direction that where we want to go to. We want to make it extremely easy. We don't want to to expose developers to the complexity of Kubernetes, of containers, as much as they can. And At the same time, we want for developers that are that wants to use the Kubernetes API or want to or are comfortable with Kubernetes, we are also trying to make it possible to use Kubernetes component in the Devfile with the Kubernetes resource component. So we want to allow experienced developers that knows Kubernetes well to use that and to be empowered by the Devfile spec.
Yeah, I like that. So you can if you want to, but you definitely don't need to.
Yes, and definitely like your first experience should be you don't even see the Devfile. So you see that the development environment is started and that you can do things, you can code and you can develop. But if you don't need to see it right away. You need to see it if you want to change the features of your development environment. At that point, yes, it's important that you start looking at the spec, understanding, looking at documentation.
Great. So if anyone has any questions, y'all have been great with the questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for that. I'm going to go ahead and do a recap and make sure I understand everything that you've taught me today. Do you feel ready for that, Mario?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. I'm adding here testing strategy. All right. So first we talked about what the world was like before Devfile that caused it to need to get created. So technically, development environments were being defined, but not in a human-friendly way. You said they were like repeating some things. They weren't easy to update. It sounds like there could be drift too. And at first, they were in your personal team that helped create Devfile in the first place. At first, you were creating development environment specifications for Eclipse Chase specifically, but later you expanded it once the Devfile spec to other tools. So then we talked more generally, like what should we define and what needs to be defined in a development environment. The short answer is everything that happens in the inner development loop should be defined. But some examples of that would be development tools, backing services, containers to build or test applications to build, your container build strategy, commands and tasks. You need to define your Kubernetes resources, your testing strategy. So there are lots and lots of things to think about. I imagine one of these dev files can get to be pretty big for a more complex development environment. So then why do we need a development environment specification? The big thing is to make a development environment repeatable. So that can be good for onboarding. It also can enable ephemeral development environments, which are starting to become a goal of some companies to not have that development environment running all the time. It can be spun up as needed. And then the development environment specification, because it's a spec, it could be tool agnostic. So you're going to choose a tool that implements the development, the dev im file. And then later, if you want to change your tool, it should be not as complex. You're avoiding vendor lock-in by having a specification there. So that brings us to the definition of what a dev file is, which is a specification for defining a cloud development environment in YAML format. So specifically, you do that by defining components within your dev file YAML. And there are two different types of components you can define. You can define a container component, or you can define Kubernetes resources component. So the container component is a container, and then the Kubernetes resources can include manifests that you use for production. So the idea with the Kubernetes resources specifically is to accomplish devprod parity, which is one of the 12 factor app factors for microservices. So you want to use the dev file and the Kubernetes components of the dev file to keep your development environment as close as possible to your production environment. So the Kubernetes components specifically, you could add things like readiness probe or memory or CPU limits or things that you know are going to happen in production, go ahead and add those things in at the development level so they don't cause you trouble later when you're trying to deploy to production. So, and then some examples of container components would be like an OpenJDK container component or a Python container component. You might add Git to your container. And you said coming soon as a universal developer image. So a universal container component. So no matter what language you're developing in, you can just use that image. So containers are useful for developing on Kubernetes, and then the Kubernetes components are useful for testing. And then we talked about different commands you would want to use. So Devfile commands are defined in the Devfile, and they're predefined commands that are available in the UI. So these predefined commands are going to be available in whatever tool you choose to implement your Devfile. So the way that they're available, that manifestation is going to be dependent on which tool you choose. But these commands are paired with a component one-to-one. And we had lots of different examples: install commands, compile commands, testing commands, start commands, kubectl commands, debugging commands, and even CI/CD, because you might want to, even though we're talking about inner development loop here, we do want to concern ourselves with how things are going to relate to production. And so the CI/CD will come in handy at that point. And then because you may want to run many commands in a row, we also have a composite command, which references commands that will be executed sequentially. And so that composite command is a component itself. Yeah, it's a component itself. So yeah.
So a complete command is a one different type of command.
So basically, it because the command and the component are one-to-one, this composite command is a way to make several commands into one command and then pair it with a component.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So that would be if you need to do something that takes a lot of commands, for example, setting up a database. So one good thing about Devfile is that it can define company best practices. And then one way it can do that is with the Devfile registry. So a registry can be online, publicly accessible catalog for Devfiles that are used for a starter. So you're likely to pull down something to like, I want to make a Java application. I'll get a Java Devfile that has the tools that I want, and then I'll customize things for the versions or whatever that for my particular environment, and then apply. So it's kind of a quick start, but you're also likely to customize it for your own use case. But then companies can have private registries that are internal to them to distribute Devfiles. So if they want to give like a boilerplate dev environment that they want every developer to start on so that they're following security best practices, for example, then they can do that and distribute that internally. And that's how it can help define company best practices. There's also a Devfile library, which is an SDK to implement Devfiles. So it's like a toolkit. If someone would want to build another tool besides the pre-existing ones to be able to use Devfiles, they would probably start by using the Devfile library. And then we talked about examples of tools that implement Devfiles. So we have OpenShift Devspaces, the Odo, did you call it? Which is a CLI tool, Odo?
Yeah, I call it Odo.
Odo? It's fun to say regardless, right? And then Code Catalyst is an example, JetBrains Space. So AWS is Code Catalyst, and then JetBrains has one called Space. So you got there's some big names behind Devfile that are using Devfile. And then we talked about a Kubernetes custom resource called Dev Workspace. So it helps you can define, using this custom resource and a Devfile, you can define what a workload looks as a Kubernetes, your development environment looks like as a Kubernetes workload. And so that's going to represent a Kubernetes resource with a custom controller that represents your development environment. So Kubernetes has that infamous reconcile loop. So basically, Kubernetes is you're going to define what you want your development environment to look like. Kubernetes with its reconcile loop is going to make sure what your development environment actually looks like is always in the same state as how you've defined it to look. So if you make a little modification to how you define it, then that automatically gets created by Kubernetes for you, which is handy dandy. So the Devfile is at the core of the CRD. And then we talked about the developer experience with the Devfile. And the nitty gritty of the developer experience is probably going to change based on what tool you use to implement. But the basic idea is you get a Devfile, and it can be maybe from a registry to make it super simple so you're not writing anything. And then you pair that Devfile with the tool, and then you're off to the races and you're able to develop. And so you said you probably should have some knowledge of containers because you might need to say what containers you need to start working. But for example, you might just need like, I need a Python container. Like it doesn't have to be deep container knowledge, it sounds like. And then y'all have an upcoming VS Code extension that's meant to make it even more simple to start. So it's like a Devfile walkthrough. So it asks the developer some questions, the developer answers those questions, and then based on that, a Devfile is generated that they can then apply and then start developing. But the idea is to make Kubernetes, the Kubernetes piece, invisible to a developer so they don't have to worry about it. How's that? How did I do? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that is really fantastic how you sum it up. So I think I'm impressed, honestly.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is, and the only thing that I would add. So because listening to that, I was thinking we have talked a lot about Kubernetes. Kubernetes is not the only target. In particular, like with AWS at the very beginning. They were considering Kubernetes as an option, but then they also wanted to have plain Docker support, meaning that the container components that they define in the Devfile will be translated not in Kubernetes pods, but in just Docker containers. So it will be just and they. So their implementation of the Devfile has been a plugin for Docker. So actually, the Docker command would take a Devfile, an input, and will then execute. Create and start containers based on the definition written in the Devfile. So that's the another way to use it. So it's not. So I think that I just that didn't come to my mind when I was mentioning that, because we're focusing really on Kubernetes. At least my team is focusing on Kubernetes, but the idea was not to. It was really for remote, for cloud development environment. No matter if it's the underlying platform is Kubernetes or another container technology. So the important thing is that we want development environment to run in containers, so that makes them repeatable, and it enables the ephemeral development environments that makes them fast to start and easy to scale. But yeah, the underlying platform is not important.
Okay, so what's important is that, well, it's ephemeral and it's reproducible. The cloud part, I'd say, is probably important, but as opposed to it being what the cloud looks like exactly, that piece is not important. So exactly. Kubernetes is popular, but also it could be Docker, for example, or I'm sure other things that we won't get into. Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. This has been an absolute joy. Is there anything you'd like to add? Thank you also, everyone who's come and interacted in chat. And even those who haven't interacted in chat, thanks for hanging out with us. It's been really fun. Anything else to say about Devfile before we do a little dancing and say goodbye? No? You're good? You're like, how do I get out of dancing? Just make a show. Exactly. Just like, this is good. It'll be fun. Here we go. Hell yeah, you're doing it. Yeah, that's perfect. We're like waving goodbye and dancing at the same time. Goodbye.
Goodbye,
Yeah.
everyone. Thank you, Whitney.